Well, Sophie Mokoena is the SABC News International Editor, and she joins me in studio to unpack all of this developing. Sophie, a very good afternoon to you. Let's start with the protests that we are seeing primarily in California. Of course, many people calling for Trump to call off, the U.S. Guard. How is this escalating matters? Just speak now about what's happening on the ground at the moment.
Well, we are aware that early hours of this morning in the United States of America, pockets of protesters have started converging. But as you pointed out, the president of the U.S. has called on law enforcement agencies, including the military or the army, to quell this these protests around California, particularly Los Angeles. And therefore, we expect that it will not be as hectic as it was last night and during the day. But in the evening, you can't vouch for peace and quietness, because you know that when people come back from work, because these immigrants are working in America, they are doing the kind of work Americans wouldn't be comfortable in doing, and therefore you expect that later in the evening you will see those protests. That will be early hours of South African time due to the time difference with the U.S. And we saw President Trump was very angry yesterday, including Vice President J.D. Vance. And therefore, we expect a heavy clampdown. But the issue here is that this problem, it's not only in Los Angeles in terms of clamping down on immigrants. It's all over the United States of America. I remember talking to some people who are South Africans who are working in the U.S., expressing fear that they might be picked up anytime, and that is why they always carry passports, including their visa, working visas, and also the South African ID, just to be able to identify themselves. I mean, who thought at this day and age America will be like that, where people are almost in an era of the past law, something that we saw during apartheid in South Africa. But President Trump will argue that there are too many illegal immigrants or nationals, foreign nationals, and some of them are committing crime in his country, and he's trying to address that. And this has become a real thorny issue. We are waiting to hear what is President Trump going to say today in terms of other arrangements that are being made to ensure that this doesn't become a problem for America. You know that at this moment we have FIFA Club World Cup. You have countries who are arriving in the United States of America, different teams from around the world who will be participating in the games of FIFA Club World Cup. We know that from South Africa. I spoke earlier on to Mamelodi Sundowns officials. They told me that Masandawana have landed in America. It's not only Masandawana, countries in the Middle East, countries in Asia, in Europe, on the continent, the teams will be participating, or the clubs will be participating. And you can imagine the fear, particularly if you look at spectators. You expect that foreign nationals from those respective countries where you have teams who are participating, let's take, for example, Mamelodi Sundowns, you'll expect South Africans to go and support Sundowns on the ground, even though we don't have many South Africans in the United States of America. And therefore the question is, what impact will this have in terms of those who would have wanted to go and support the teams from their respective countries, but also looking ahead to the World Cup and the Olympic? If this issue is not resolved on time, are we going to see people traveling to the U.S.? What impact will this have in tourism in the U.S.? Because people have fears, much as they have papers, but those guys, when they arrive, ICE, that's the Immigration Customs Enforcement, sometimes they're so brutal, you can't even engage them. They just take you, you get bumped into these vans, then you are quickly taken to an area where you might be taken to a complete different country that you don't come from or reside from.
I think you're quite correct in terms of that spreading of fear. But this also comes as Trump's order banning citizens of 12 countries entering the United States takes effect today. I mean, when one looks at the wording in Trump's proclamation that happened, of course, in January before the several countries ban took effect, is that to identify countries throughout the world for which vetting and screening information is so deficient as to warrant a full or partial suspension on the admission of nationals. I mean, that says a lot about just several of those countries then that the US has decided to ban fully or partially some of their citizens.
Well, it's when your country doesn't have proper democracy institutions and institutions of government. Because if proper work was being done, when people apply for their documents like the passport, your ID, then the Americans in their respective embassies and consul generals will be able to approve such trips. But these countries, when you look at them, in some of these countries, there's lawlessness, there's war, and therefore processes of issuing of documents can be fraudulent. Some of them are even using documents from other countries, and therefore that poses a problem from the United States of America. That is why the US has taken a decision to do that. For example, a country like Sudan, the country is at war and people are leaving Sudan, and they can use any form of identification just to leave Sudan. Chad, because Chad is receiving majority of those refugees who might not be having proper papers. And then you go to Central Africa. Central Africa, I don't know, that region is just a mess. I mean, the Congo-Brazzaville, not the DRC. Much as people are questioning, there's relative peace in Congo-Brazzaville compared to Congo, the DRC, but he wants the minerals of Congo, DRC. He was not going to do that. You look at many countries, Libya. Libya is a failed state, and therefore it's problematic. And then you have countries such as Burundi. Burundi has been having challenges for quite a long time. We know even President Mandela tried to intervene to bring peace in the Great Lakes region. So identification and issuing of documents in those regions sometimes can be quite problematic. And I think South Africans must be happy that they are not in the list either of those countries ban or where they've imposed restrictions. That brings us to the question, is that visit to the White House working? Because some white Afrikaners were pushing that President Trump must ban South Africa.
Yeah, and just talking about that White House visit, of course, you were earlier reporting that President Cyril Ramaphosa will be traveling to Canada over the weekend for the G7 Leaders Summit. We understand, of course, that US President Donald Trump will also be there. Speak to us about what we're likely to see there in terms of the two presidents engaging again.
I think for me, it's about the G7 in totality. You know that President Trump signed lots of executive orders, as you pointed out, when he took office, and particularly on tariffs. Many countries were affected. Now it's a moment to face the G7 member countries in a form of a group. And I'm sure by now they've lobbied each other in terms of how they are going to push America to look at how it's handling issues of trade and investment, because you have the World Trade Organization where you are supposed to go when you are aggrieved. In terms of South Africa, you had the president's spokesperson, Vincent, saying that there is no bilateral lined up for the president with the US counterpart, because they met at the Oval Office not long ago. But let me tell you, it's not about a proper sit-down private meetings. Even when these guys are walking for a photo op, they whisper in each other's ear in terms of what they would want to the two countries should focus on. For example, Macron can decide to say to Trump, just a whisper, please, man, don't be so brutal on immigrants. Or President Trump can say to President Ramaphosa, we are told at the White House behind the scenes, even though some are saying he was joking, he said President Ramaphosa must take Elon Musk. So who knows, when they are working, the issue of Elon Musk might come up again. I'm just saying that in diplomacy, you don't need 5-7 hours to talk about thorny issues.
Absolutely, Sophie. Thank you so much for that. Of course, Sophie, just addressing that last point there. President Ramaphosa is expected to be traveling then to Canada this coming weekend after being invited to attend the G7 Leaders Summit.